Starting with the 11th century in medieval Europe, we start to see a number of changes that are really going to kind of change the way we understand medieval society. Some of those changes were in agriculture. Now, earlier in the Middle Ages, people worked with what was called a two-field system. Essentially, half the land you had was used to grow food, and the other half you would lay fallow. Fallow means it wasn't used. If you used all the land at once, constantly, it would reduce the soil and you wouldn't be able to grow anything. So by alternating which land they used, they were able to preserve their soil. What that meant was only about half the land was ever used at one time to grow food. Later, they discovered that by planting different kinds of crops that grow at different times and use different parts of the soil, things like legumes or beans, they were able to use the same amount of soil without having to let it lay fallow. So this is called the three-field system, where one part of the land is used for a crop that's planted in the spring, like grain. One is used for a winter crop, like peas or beans, and then you let the other third fallow. By doing this, Europeans were able to produce more food. At this point, 2/3 of the land is being used to produce food. So you saw an increase in food that way. Another change was the use of the horse. Early in the Middle Ages, people used oxen to draw their plows. Horses were faster and could work longer. So by using horses and using this three-field system, you saw some ways that agriculture changed on farms. And what this really did was increase the productivity of these farms. You're able to grow more food with less people. Around the same time, you start to see the growth of trade. Some of this happens with the Crusades, but also it happened earlier, where you start to see an influx in demand for goods. Now, as we saw, manors and fiefs were pretty independent. They didn't require a lot of trade. So most of this trade is in luxury goods. So merchants would gather their goods, and annually they'd go around to different towns or castles and have these trade fairs where people would come from all over, different villages and different manors, to trade goods. As these trade fairs grew, they started to become more important in the medieval economy. And as trade became more important, so did important skilled labor, like crafting, making things out of wood or leather or metal. And around crafting, you had the development of these guilds. Guilds are associations of workers from the same trade. So leather workers in one town might make a guild. Metal workers. Whatever particular group of people would form their own guild. And guilds are important in a number of ways. For one, they regulated the quality of the goods that are produced. So if you were in a town that had a guild and you wanted to sell something, you had to have guild approval to sell it. That meant people couldn't just show up and try and sell low-quality goods. Guilds also regulated how much people were paid for particular skills, so they regulated the prices of those goods. And they acted kind of like an insurance. If you were a guild member and you died, they would take care of your widow or your children. So guilds became an important part of these medieval towns that started to grow after the 10th century. The process of becoming a guild member was regulated. So if you wanted to take on a skill, let's say you wanted to become a blacksmith, you would first become an apprentice. An apprentice is somebody who worked under the master of the guild, and their job mostly was to sort of do the simple labor, learn their tasks, and often they had to pay to do this, and they lived under their master's household. Later, they become a journeyman. Journeymen were so called because they were sent out on a journey. A journeyman guild member would go out and practice their trade somewhere else. Journeymen were allowed to sell their own goods, but they had to send a portion back to their masters at the guild. Now, if you wanted to become a master, you had to make sort of a piece of production that showed you the highest quality skill you had, or a masterpiece. If you did that, and you received permission from the other guild masters, you could become a master of the guild. A guild master could run their own shop and take on their own apprentices. Now, in reality, very few skilled workers became masters because this was a valued part of the guild and you made a lot of money, and many of the guild masters didn't want to open up their ranks to other people who could sort of cut in on their business. So later economists would sort of criticize the guild system for limiting who could actually become a master, no matter how skilled they were. As we move into the time of the Crusades, and as you saw farms become more efficient, you start to see towns regrow. Recall that with the fall of the Roman Empire, towns and cities really declined. Well, with lords off crusading, and with less work to do on farms, many people moved to the cities. They saw more opportunities. They could take on new skills. They could avoid the heavy taxes and feudal obligations that they would on a fief. So you started to see from around the year 1000 on the population of towns across Europe increase. These towns were, not very well planned. Often they were overcrowded. It wasn't uncommon for towns to burn down because all the roofs are made of thatch, for diseases to quickly sweep through because there really were no sewer systems or really not that much in the way of sanitation. But towns became more and more popular. And you start to see the growth of a middle class. So far, remember, in the Middle Ages, you really have the clergy, the nobility, and everybody else. But with these people living in towns, and especially among the sort of merchant and skilled labor classes, you had this new group of people called the burghers. Burg is the German or Dutch word for a town. So burghers really just means townspeople. And the burghers became an important social class. They became a tax base for the king. Since they lived in cities, which weren't part of fiefs, the only person who could collect taxes on them were the kings. Later, the lords will try to sort of regain some power by charging burghers tolls on roads or any way they could sort of exert power on them. But now you have a middle class in medieval Europe, and that's going to really develop later on to be an important and powerful position in European society.